Thanks, Deanna. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm going to segue the presentation from talking about that lived experience into talking about some of the research that's been done to help overcome these issues and barriers that both Martine and Deanna had mentioned. And all of Quigger's research that we've done has involved different sectors and different disability groups in an attempt to include all of those key players that are involved in helping someone who's living with an episodic disability to return to the workforce and to be able to stay there. So I'd like to outline a couple of points that were part of a fairly recent research initiative. The first involved an international policy review. So we took a look at different disability and employment policies internationally to see where the best practices lie. And we did find quite a number of them in a number of different countries. And so from this policy review, we developed a series of recommendations for optimal labor force engagement on employment and income supports. Now, these recommendations also involved, on one particular point, the development of a cost-benefit analysis of what a public policy change would cost for a public income support program to see whether or not it really would be cost-effective to the Canadian public to integrate that type of change. Next, we surveyed human resources professionals about episodic disabilities to find out where their knowledge base was and where there may be gaps in terms of their understanding about episodic disabilities in employment. And lastly, we brought key players, including human resources professionals, employers, various disability groups, insurers, and researchers, all together at a national consultation to talk about what the next step should be after we had undertaken all this work. And this research that was done revealed a few different things. The first was a need for coordination among all the relevant public and private sector stakeholders. We've seen examples of this in the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden, how they've been able to come together at the table and really develop policies and programs that fit together well. Oftentimes, in Canada, we're still working in silos, especially in our income programs. And there's a need for, and given that some people do access multiple programs, that sometimes there are repercussions that come from accessing these multiple programs. And so having coordinated programs that allow someone to access multiple programs if needed and then to make a smooth transition in and out of the workplace when needed is really an important support for someone with an episodic disability. Now, in addition to this, there's a need for partial disability income supports that are integrated with someone's employment earnings so that if someone is working part-time, that they still have stable income security. And this really is a critical need for someone living with an episodic disability, because if they're uncertain of whether or not they'll be able to sustain themselves in a full-time capacity, then going back to work might be a very intimidating experience. And for some, knowing that they have a part-time option where they can still pay their bills and meet their basic needs will help them come back. And of course, for those that have private insurance plans, this does represent a significant cost savings to the insurer. Having someone in the workplace part-time is going to cost less than having them outside of the workplace completely. Our next point under these lessons learned is that there is a need for more participation options for people living with episodic disabilities. Now, these may not come in the form necessarily of new positions, but rather looking at the way that we have our jobs structured in new ways, including opportunities to work from home or from remote locations, as well as opportunities for flexible employment hours as someone's needs may require. In addition to what Martine had mentioned, she talked about the need about the movement of someone living with an episodic disability in and out of the workplace. And that idea of being able to have opportunities to allow someone to come in and out as their needs express themselves is one of the most important elements when we talk about episodic disabilities in employment. And so we coined a term to really illustrate this idea, and it's the term flexicurity. This idea connotes the need for that flexibility to move in and out of the workplace as one's health needs require, but also to have that stability that comes through, or that security that comes through stable income support. Now, next, human resources professionals, through that survey that we conducted, are in need of additional training on episodic disabilities in employment. And this training, I'll speak to that as well a little bit later, there are opportunities now available to support them through online curriculums that Quigger has developed. And lastly, there's a need for more insurance options to remove disincentives to participate in the labor force to one's potential. With the insurers that we've spoken with, it's an interesting situation that some insurers are looking for employers to come to them and let them know what they're looking for in terms of a program. If programs really aren't meeting the needs of your employees, perhaps there's a window of opportunity there to speak with them and let them know where you need more flexibility or where you need to make some adaptations or changes, and then use that going forward. I'm going to transition the presentation now into talking about what happens in our own workplaces and get into some of the more practical and concrete suggestions on what you can do to help support your employees living with episodic disabilities. Now, you can imagine for a moment if you're a person living with an episodic disability and you're about to return to work. This is a very anxiety-filled time for many individuals. There's a lot of uncertainties that they may be experiencing, and these uncertainties are primarily around three different areas that I'd like to discuss. The first is, when I go back, will I experience some form of stigma or discrimination? What might my employer think of perhaps the gap that I've had in my employment? Will my coworkers know that I've experienced some kind of illness, and what if my health isn't stable? Will they ask questions? Will I be able to still be comfortable with engaging with them to whatever degree I might disclose my illness? Next, if I've been out of the workforce for a number of years, are my skills current? Will I be able to talk with my employer about that gap? And how should I do that in appropriate ways? Last is, should I disclose? Is there someone appropriate for me to talk to in my workplace about my illness, or should I keep that to myself? Coming to terms with some of these questions and finding appropriate answers are difficult challenges for many. But knowing this as an employer and as managers can help you to prepare someone and to make them feel more comfortable knowing that they're grappling with these uncertainties with their employment. Now, as managers and leaders in our workplaces, there are some things that you can do to help prepare someone as they're coming back. Now, we recognize that there is responsibility that needs to be placed from the employer's side, but also from the person living with the episodic disability. We're going to address in these next slides primarily the role of the employer, but there are some questions that the employee should be encouraged to consider on their own as they're figuring out their return to work plan and how they're going to appropriately integrate themselves into the workplace. And as well, if you have an employee who already is in the workplace but is experiencing some barriers, then some of these questions might be helpful for them as well. And so there are 8 different questions that I'm going to address. The first is, for someone outside of the workplace, what personal and health issues might need to be addressed prior to returning to work? Now, this point really hits around some of the social issues that someone may be facing, as well as their health status, whether that be physical or mental. There are oftentimes, there's the issues related to the illness that someone's experiencing, but there can be other social issues that someone may be challenged with, like, is their housing stable, or do they have access to childcare? And so these issues might need to be resolved by the person in order for them to really feel comfortable in coming back to work. Next, what limitations or restrictions might the employee have while they're in the workplace? This is getting at the need for specific forms of accommodation when someone returns to work. So we start at the point of talking about where do you feel you may have limitations, and then start to think of concrete ways that we can address those through various forms of accommodation. Now, as Deanna mentioned, she talked about the need for accommodation options for someone in the workplace. And oftentimes, the number one form of accommodation that someone may require is flex time. And so being able to have that option to perhaps work from home if that's necessary, or to be able to do a late start and then make up the time later in the day, allows someone with an episodic disability to really relax a bit in that form of employment, because they know that they can take care of their health needs, and then also they can do the work that they've been hired to do and find a good balance between those. Next point is, what will the employee do to maintain a healthy work-life balance? Now, this is primarily an employee-related question, but it is something that you can prompt them on to consider. How are they going to be able to give themselves downtime, or what are they going to use to de-stress if they're feeling that stress level rise? The next point is, does the employee have good access to health care? And this is something that Deanna did mention, that there really is a critical need for someone living with an episodic disability to have access to stable health care supports. Now, When that actually happens really varies from person to person. We find that often some of the most difficult times for someone living with an episodic disability is that period before they really are diagnosed and before they really understand how they need to manage their own illness. And so do know that you may have employees that are experiencing this gap where they're looking for supports and services but may not have them all in place yet. And that working with them through this, asking them, there may need to be fairly frequent check-ins during this time to see where they're at and what their needs may be. But once those healthcare supports are in place, things may become more stable for that individual. So that it's kind of a time where someone may be wrestling with a number of different challenges, but you can provide helpful supports during that period. Next is when that employee does have those supports in place and they understand what they need to do, what is their plan to be able to maintain good health? And when they know how they're going to move forward, how comfortable will they be in communicating their accommodation needs to you? There's addressing these accommodation challenges requires the individual to have a fairly high degree of self-awareness and understanding of what their own needs are. And some individuals do this very, very well. Others struggle with it a little bit and may need some prompts and suggestions on things that they can do to be more successful in their job. But understanding the accommodation needs is one part of it. Are they comfortable in coming back to you and requesting those needs? Now, this hits at a piece that I'm going to talk to next about how can good communication be maintained with that employee. Now, that piece is one of, I'd mentioned the need for flexibility as being critical for someone with an episodic disability. Good communication really is the other piece, because the nature of this illness is such that there will be these periodic fluctuations in health status over the long term for this individual. And so there's a need to maintain strong communication practices over the long term, so that someone knows where they need to go, what that process looks like to be able to ask someone and for an accommodation, and that they're able to do that in a way that they can express themselves without feeling uncomfortable and judged. And last point in this series is the employee experiencing challenges with coworkers. We can have wonderful policies and programs in place, but there is still a need to work with coworkers to help them understand episodic disabilities and their impact on the workplace, to create an environment where all coworkers and staff feel that their ideas are welcomed and valued and that they're an active and contributing part of their workplace. And we'll speak to that point a little bit later. Now, with this employee, in addition to those questions, you can also do a couple of things. One, you can show understanding for that person and their need to have good health care and employment supports in place. Now, all employment situations are going to look different because people living with episodic disabilities are all quite different. And their comfort level in communicating and disclosing their status is going to vary. And so you may have a situation where you know that someone's living with something, but you may not have any idea what it is. You also may have an individual who discloses completely, or something in between those two. But one thing that you can do, regardless of whether or not you know someone's health status, is to show understanding. And you can do that by simple questions like, how are you today? How are you feeling? Is there anything that I can do for you? And oftentimes, as Deanna mentioned, the answer to that will be no. But that show of support really goes a long way to help someone feel comfortable and in knowing that you're sincere and genuine in your interest to help them. In addition to that, you can explore ways to open up channels of communication. Now, because we're all very different in our styles of communicating, you can speak with the individual and ask them how they would like this process to happen. Some people prefer something that's very structured and regular and formal. Others prefer something that's informal, like meeting with someone in the hall or perhaps after work on a lunch hour and just doing a brief check-in about how things are going in a more relaxed setting. Third point with supporting employees is to explore a variety of different accommodation options. As I mentioned earlier, some employees are very aware of what their options are and what their rights are in the workplace in terms of accommodation options, but many are not. And so as employers, letting them know what you as an employer can do for them and are willing to do really goes, again, a long way to helping them. Now, this is something that accommodation training is something that can be done from the time of hire, and it can be done periodically with your employees as you feel that that's needed. So taking that very proactive approach lets all employees know whether or not what your practices are and how you can support them. And this is something that here in Ontario is being encouraged through the new AODA Act. Lastly, as you're doing these accommodation plans, do take that long-term perspective so that you are able to know that these communication plans and these check-ins will be happening on a regular basis over the long term. They may be fairly short, but you and the employee can sit down and figure out when should these happen and what format should they take. Now, let's move on to talking about coworkers. Because coworkers really do play a critical role in helping to establish an organizational culture that's inclusive and inviting. With coworkers, you can talk about one, what episodic disabilities are and how they impact an individual who's working with them. Chances are in your workplace there is someone living with an episodic disability, whether large or small. This type of training can be very helpful to all employees. Next, discuss with all of your employees what your accommodation practices are and what you have to offer them, and that you're willing to support them if they have a need for an accommodation at some point, that there's not preferential treatment being given to one person because they're living with a particular form of illness, but that you're willing to support all of your employees. Next, encourage the coworkers to find appropriate ways to support their colleagues living with episodic disabilities. Now, oftentimes the coworkers will not know what the episodic disability is that someone may be living with, but shows of support like genuinely and sincerely asking, how are you? It's nice to see you. And avoiding some of the questions that target perhaps, what's wrong? Why were you off last week, perhaps? Using very sincere questions that are very broad in nature. So coworkers can be a very wonderful form of support for someone living with an episodic disability. And asking those types of questions about what can be done and how you can help will help someone to be able to stay in the workplace. We have heard of instances where it has been the managers and the employers have had good, strong policies in place, and they've done their role very, very well. But the training with the coworkers hasn't happened quite as effectively as it could have. And individuals have left the workplace because they've struggled with particular coworkers that they may have known. So there may need to be a need for training. In addition to that, working with that individual, working with perhaps coworkers that may be struggling with their colleague living with the episodic disability to help them better understand how they can support them and what you're willing to do. Oftentimes these coworkers want to know that you have a plan in place, that they're not going to be picking up significant increased workload because of the other individual who may be in and out of the workplace. And so if they know that you've got a plan and that you're willing to support them as they deal with the changes with this other individual being off, they're often more willing and accepting of the special accommodations that may be in place for that other employee. So, next slide. So, as an employer, if you do have someone coming to you, it can be helpful to know what other supports are available to that employee. Now, often underutilized are our employee assistance programs. We often think that they're there, but many employees don't know what their employee assistance programs offer. And some are also unaware of even how to access their EAP program. So it can be as simple as passing out a pamphlet or as part of a staff training every few months. Let your employees know that that's there, that it's developed for them, and that they're welcome to use it with no repercussions. Next are peer associations. Now these are a very special type of organization that is driven by individuals living with a particular form of episodic disability or disability in general for others living with that same type of illness. And they can offer a unique type of support because they've lived through that particular type of experience, and they really have that experience. and really can empathize with what's happening. And so that's one option. And many of those can be found by looking online and searching the particular type of illness. And so you can suggest that as one option. Next, there are a variety of professional disability associations like the National Network for Mental Health and the Arthritis Society, to just name two. And these organizations provide a variety of different forms of educational and temporal and social supports, depending on the type of organization and their training. Many of their satellite offices are located in communities across the country. And so again, by searching online or by asking through the Employee Assistance Program, you may be able to provide an appropriate referral for someone. So in summary, as you're developing your programs and policies for episodic disabilities in the workplace, do take into account the need for different forms of social supports that someone may face. Like, as I mentioned, the need for stable housing or childcare, perhaps other issues that they may be struggling with as well. And as you're refining some of the policies that you may have, look at the episodic nature of the illness. Does that policy offer enough flexibility for someone who may be moving in and out of the workplace? Next is, from the top down, take a proactive approach to developing a workplace culture that focuses on the full integration of all staff. Now, this workplace culture is something that when coworkers and colleagues see that their employer is willing to take a stance, that they do feel that they're supported, and is something that you can develop over time. Lastly, include very strong communications protocol between management and HR and your staff in all of your policies. And that strong communications stance in the long term really will help someone to not go off when they're feeling ill. So those are a few of the highlights that can help you as you're supporting your employees living with episodic disabilities. And we'd love to work with you more, whether it be in terms of education or if there are other forms of support that we can provide to you through the Ontario Episodic Disabilities Network or the National Episodic Disabilities Network that Martine mentioned. We're happy to do that. So if there are ways that we can assist you, please do let us know. So thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to hearing from you.